I'm Courtney Hammond-Wagner. I'm a PhD student here at the GUND, and it's my pleasure to introduce Ken Bagstad today. He is a research economist and former Mendenhall postdoctoral fellow working with the U.S. Geological Survey's Geosciences and Environmental Change Science Center in Denver. His work uses GIS and modeling to quantify, map, and value ecosystem service flows across the United States and globally. Obviously very relevant to GUND because he's also a GUND alum. Received his PhD here at UVM, master's in plant biology from Arizona State, and bachelor's from Ohio Wesleyan University. So welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be back here. Things look a little different from when I graduated 5 years ago, but it's a packed house, which is awesome. So when I was a PhD student at GUND, I noticed that we have always done fantastic work here at UVM and at GUND at the local and state level here in Vermont, and at the international level. There's always great, fascinating work going on. And I was always interested in sort of the gap in between those two, thinking about the national level, and basically on my way to USGS near the end of my PhD program, and for some postdoctoral work, and now permanently. And in the words of another ecological economics alum, back when the Institute was at Maryland, Trista Patterson, who really encouraged me to go into federal service. I think it's a great option to both continue research, to work with management agencies, and to work on some of our pressing national problems. So I'm here to say that if you're all interested in it, think about ways to continue with carrying ecological economics into the way our government's making decisions, and I think it's a really exciting path. And I'm happy to talk with any after the talk or by email afterwards if you have any interest in that type of thing about career paths in federal service. So, that out of the way and my federal recruiting pitch done. I also want to start out by thanking a lot of folks that I've been fortunate to collaborate with over the years, and a lot of this work built on their collaboration and support. So I just want to throw that up there from the start and thank a lot of my collaborators and colleagues that I've been fortunate to work with. I like to start ecosystem services with this, and I was Calvin when I was 6 years old. I was running around in the woods, maybe not with a stuffed tiger, but I think this is just a great intro to the problem of ecosystem services for those of you who haven't seen it.
Are you going to read that?
Sure, yeah, for the folks in the back. So Calvin on the left pane is saying people keep talking about opening up more wilderness for development. We seem to understand the value of oil, timber, minerals, and housing, but not the value of unspoiled beauty, wildlife, solitude, and spiritual renewal. And Hobbes on the far right saying, we need to start putting a price on the priceless. Calvin says, yeah, if our woods are worth a zillion, jillion, bagillion, think of what Alaska's worth. So this is great. This was like in the early to mid 90s, I think, before even some of the seminal stuff about ecosystem services had come out, and one of our greatest comic strip drawers was thinking about this already, which is awesome. So on one hand, I say it's simple enough for a 6-year-old and a stuffed tiger. On the other hand, anyone who's worked in the field knows about the complexities of linking human systems and social science and natural systems and natural science. And then we take this to the federal agency level, where I'm working. USGS is the science agency for the Department of Interior, so we're fortunate to be able to work with agencies like the BLM, the Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and we have some collaborations with non-interior agencies too, like the Forest Service, NOAA, some of the other science and management agencies across the federal government. So what we have on the federal side is we have these Washington offices of many of these resource management agencies that are really interested in all the things that ecosystem services bring to the table, all these different benefits that they can provide for management. And then we have, in many cases, especially here in the western U.S., well, not here, but out there where I call home these days, we have these huge tracts of federal land. You'll have a field office that manages 1 million acres, and they don't have the kind of skills we have in this room, the folks with experience in ecology and economics and social science and GIS. So they're short on all this. We've got these if not mandates, then strong recommendations coming down from a number of federal agencies. So how do we bridge that gap? And my interest has been in developing practical tools and thinking about ways to lower the barriers for folks in these field offices use these tools and to make more regular assessments. There's other groups that are interested in this too. Been working with a group over the last 2 years that's going to be releasing a big report on ecosystem services and federal agency decision making, the National Ecosystem Services Partnership. They've convened a couple of workshops through NCs and CSync over the last 2 years, and they'll be putting out a guidebook on ecosystem services for federal agencies at this year's ACES conference in December. So again, hope to see some of you down there, and I know a few folks from this room will be attending, so look out for that if you're interested in the nexus between ecosystem services and agency decision making. One of the earliest projects I did with USGS was to look at the landscape of tools for measuring, modeling, mapping, and valuing ecosystem services, and we came up with this alphabet soup here of a whole variety of tools, some of which many in this room may be familiar with. And really, I'm not. This was just what tools may be ready for use by an agency like BLM. So this was a good starting point. But what came out of this project for me is that a lot of the tools they all have their strengths and weaknesses, and rarely is one tool going to be useful for every set of circumstances. So I became interested in how can we use the best of different approaches to get the job done for giving information to managers and decision makers. And I'm going to mainly look at that from the biophysical and from the cultural ecosystem services side. So the biophysical side, those of you who have worked, I've worked for the last 7 years on the ARES project, which is a project that began here at GUND through an NSF grant. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that today. Those of you who are familiar certainly with Taylor's work with the Natural Capital Project and Invest, that's another approach that basically is combining GIS data and ecological production functions to make maps. And I don't think I need to spend any more time on that. There's lots of benefits here to mapping ecosystem services, and there's lots of expertise in this room for doing that, which is great. One of the things that I became really interested in at USGS, a couple of my colleagues developed a tool to map cultural ecosystem services, and this is a side that the biophysical tools just simply don't do well. If it's a cultural ecosystem service, it's something we ought to be asking people about the places they value and how and why they value it, rather than trying to ask a computer model to do that. That's not really the sweet spot of modeling. So there's a whole literature in the social sciences, a lot of it dating back to this fellow Greg Brown, who's now in Australia, that's looked at asking people to allocate value between cultural ecosystem services, like some of these in this box on the right, and then to map out the places they care about. And what we do is we give survey respondents 100 points or dollars to allocate, and they allocate it between these different values. And then they map out the places that correspond to that. And then we have a GIS tool called Social Values for Ecosystem Services that relates the places people place on the map for different values and the underlying biophysical characteristics. So it'll build a value surface for each of those value types. And I'll show a couple of examples. We, along with our colleagues, have done this for a number of national forests in the West and for a number of marine case studies. And we're looking at, can we look at the relationship between the places people value and those underlying biophysical characteristics and develop value transfers. So basically go to a place where we don't have surveys, but we do have the biophysical data, look at what the value patterns look like and validate that with some other surveys. So there's analogies to economic value transfer there, but to do it from a spatial perspective and for cultural ecosystem services. And one of the things I really like about this tool is it's, a lot of the hardcore neoclassical economists have trouble when I say this, but it really is a stated preference tool, but it's not income constrained. So everybody's getting the same amount to value the landscape for different services. It's a fairly democratic, pluralistic way to get folks to think about ecosystem services, and Bill Gates versus a grad student doesn't mean that Bill Gates has, $1 million that he can have in willingness to pay, and someone who's not Bill Gates doesn't have that much to say. So everybody gets the same amount, which is nice when we think about value in public lands, which are this democratic and pluralistic institution in our country. So what this looks like, we take point locations, we model them using maximum entropy modeling, which many of you are familiar with. It basically takes point data for species and looks at the biophysical relationships and produces a map of likelihood of species occurrence. We do the same thing to produce an index from 0 to 10. So it's not monetary, but it is quantitative, and we can say that some areas are this much more valuable than others. So this is the Pikes-San Isabel National Forest in Colorado. Pikes Peak's down here, Colorado Springs, city of Denver, and a lot of Denver's water supply comes from this national forest, as well as some of our big recreational areas in the state. So we mapped this out, and these are the points people valued, and this is the surface that Maxent generates for aesthetic value in the Pikes-San Isabel. One of the things that's really exciting, I mentioned this value transfer idea, and how can we speed up the use of this? We are working on value transfer both in the national forest. There was an article out in Ecosystem Services this year. We're working on a bigger subset of national forests too. We're working on some value transfer, or we want to do some value transfer work between these different coastal sites that are being done both on the Pacific, Gulf, and Atlantic coasts. And there are ways we think that we can speed up some of these surveys through web surveys, hopefully speed up some of the data collection pieces, and maybe have this become something a little bit more standard that agencies and others could use for cultural ecosystem service mapping. But really the interest I mentioned before was combining this cultural with the biophysical, and this is a sort of Venn diagram that I came up with, that we have a paper currently resubmitted to Regional Environmental Change that's looking at joint mapping of biophysical and cultural services. And really, when do you want to use deterministic, probabilistic approaches and public participatory GIS, or social values, or cultural ecosystem services mapping? This goes by slightly different names in different parts of the literature, but there are different times and places when different approaches may be more or less applicable and appropriate. And really, when we combine these two sets of data, the framework that we're using is to look at the hotspots and cold spots for these. And we can statistically identify these hotspots and cold spots. And our working hypotheses are that if we map out these cultural ecosystem services on one axis and biophysical services on another axis, which in this case we've used areas, but you could use any type of biophysical modeling software, Invest or others, for the same purpose. And our idea is that there's going to be places that people value a lot, and there's going to be places that provide a lot of ecosystem services and places that don't provide as many ecosystem services. And in places where there's high social and high ecological ecosystem service delivery, those may be places where we can anticipate either synergies with management or potential conflict if the things that people are used to doing and value it for don't jive well with preserving ecosystem services. Cases where high social value and low ecosystem services may be places where we can leave well enough alone, thinking about a land management perspective. High ecosystem services and low social values may be places where an agency might need to think about outreach or education in terms of making folks aware of why a place is important if there's not the recognition. And then for some agencies like the Forest Service and the BLM that do multi-use management and some extractive resource use, the places that are low social values, low ecosystem service delivery may be places that are appropriate for resource extraction, assuming there aren't other issues with biodiversity, Native American cultural sites, things like that. So this is a sort of management heuristic we've been working on with some of our public land management partners. And what that actually looks like, this paper I mentioned for the Pikes-San Isabel National Forest, we've got a social value survey for residents, we've got some biophysical models of ecosystem services, we sum those up and we do statistical analysis for hotspots, and this is what we get. We get different areas showing up in the high, low, high, and low. And one of the things that was really interesting about this was the importance of wilderness. The black outlined areas here are wilderness points. The little triangles here are these 14,000-foot peaks, which a lot of folks in Colorado really like to climb or do mountaineering, backcountry skiing. And even if you don't do that, they're just these beautiful, iconic mountain peaks. And So there was a lot of recognition of both social value. You see some of the yellow here along the spine of the Continental Divide. Those are the high social value. A lot of ecosystem service delivery to the green and red areas in those wilderness areas. And we're expanding this analysis to cover 5 other national forests in Colorado and Wyoming. And one of the interesting things is public perceptions of wilderness, especially in the Front Range of Colorado, where you have a really urban population, and far northwest Wyoming in the area around Jackson, and much more rural, much more culturally older populations, cultural differences, different perceptions and values of wilderness up there. So we're hoping, well, we'll be presenting some of the results of this at ACES on the 6 forest analysis. So, so stay tuned for that. We're excited for that and other work up ahead. I'll mention real briefly some work with ecosystem service mapping on the San Pedro River in southeast Arizona, which was my first foray into work with USGS. This is a really important migratory bird flyway. It's a river that starts in Mexico, flows into the Gila River, which eventually meets the Colorado. One of the last undammed, perennially flowing rivers in the southwestern US, so high biological significance and a lot of water management trade-offs with BLM. So we mapped a bunch of ecosystem services. I showed you the slide earlier where we were looking at different tools and what tools might give us some answers on this. One of the really interesting things that I liked out of this was getting to directly compare to biophysical models, Ares and Invest, and not from a boxing match perspective of which one's better, but from a can we replicate results of 2 different tools that come at things from a different sort of scientific and philosophical paradigm. And one of the things that was really interesting is when we looked at big landscape scale change, a fairly unrestricted housing development scenario that was just putting housing all across the landscape, the models really didn't differ that much. So that's encouraging. That's the kind of thing we would hope to see if we think that these are replicable and are gonna give us consistent results across time and space. That became less the case when we had more limited impacts in a more limited development scenario, and it definitely was not the case when we looked at a really site-specific management scenario that was just management for a couple of 100 acres. So again, what we saw here was fairly good agreement between 2 tools when we had a widespread landscape scale change. That wasn't the case for small scale. And really, I've been talking to folks when I present this research over the last 2 years or so, and just saying we need more of these comparative studies. We need to know not only when do different ecosystem service tools agree and disagree, but when do they agree and disagree with biophysical models that some of them are built on. So this is a broader scientific question of when are these going to be appropriate and less appropriate, and which ones are going to better answer our management questions. We've been working for about the last year on extending that approach I mentioned for the Forest Service to work with the National Park Service. So we've got a pilot project with the Park Service at Cape Lookout National Seashore in North Carolina, and also at Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. And the Park Service is interested in this. Park Service has been collecting visitation and economic data for years about the benefits of national parks, but we know that they produce a lot of other good things. And we also know that for parks and protected areas, there's a lot of impacts that occur outside their boundaries that affect the resource within the park and protected area. So a lot of interest in some of the spatial flow questions of ecosystem services, a lot of interest in how can parks build a better constituency for their protection, aside from just those visitor dollar values, which we know are a pretty limited view of why parks matter. So this has been a really great project and a great agency to work with, of course. Cape Lookout is in North Carolina. It's Cape Hatteras' slightly less famous twin brother. They're 2 national seashores, and most folks have heard of Cape Hatteras, where the Wright brothers did their first flight. Cape Lookout's a more remote, but a really beautiful national seashore and barrier island. And we started out by doing a set of these surveys for social values. So again, this is just what the survey looks like for this value allocation question. We describe what each of these values mean. We say you have 100 points to allocate between them, and we give them a map to put their points on for where they care about in the national seashore. We saw some really interesting differences between surf fishermen in the fall and residents, permanent residents in the area, and folks who come visit for the summer in terms of the types of values that they care about. I've highlighted some of the interesting differences. The fishing group, predominantly white male, college educated, folks coming from inland North Carolina out to the shore, was valuing, not surprisingly, recreational, but therapeutic value really highly, which I thought was interesting. This isn't a value that you think about in biophysical models, and it's not something we've really done a good job of thinking about too much as an ecosystem service community, I don't think, but it's something that shows up as a pretty important value for this user group, being able to get out into nature and have some solitude and quiet and peace away from the bustle of everyday life. And I've just highlighted a couple of other differences. These aren't statistically significant. We haven't done that analysis, at least not yet, but it's how some of these different groups perceive the value of nature from a cultural ecosystem service perspective. When we run this through the solves tool, we can show the areas that people care about. So this is this value index from 0 to 10. These are the relationships of biophysical variables to the underlying social values data. And then this is showing the points that people actually marked on the map for recreational value. In this case, this is the surf fishermen and for the fall survey and the points they care about. This looks a little different if you keep your eye on the left here. When we look at residents, they are valuing areas a little differently. And when you see the points, there's a lot more points placed here on the southern end of the island, whereas for the fishing group, it was more uniformly along the barrier island. And finally, for our summer beachgoers, again, it was more of a cluster of value, especially at the southern end of the island. So some differences in how people are using and perceiving this, but done in a spatial framework and done from an ecosystem service perspective, which is new for the Park Service. There's the biophysical side, which we're working up to for this, and we held a stakeholder meeting to talk about which ecosystem services folks care about, and we're working right now to finalize some models for coastal storm protection, fisheries, and water quality impacts, and do the same thing we did for the for the Forest Service, where we're overlaying the areas people care about and the areas that are producing these biophysical services and thinking how that can impact park management. I'll real briefly mention another project that I've been fortunate to be involved with, which is working in Hawaii on coral reef ecosystem services, and we're working with a group at University of Hawaii that's building a decision support tool for looking at sedimentation, and we're developing recreation and sediment models within areas. We're using the Invest Coastal Storm Protection model and some broader coral reef health models. So there's a whole research group out there that's combining some of these different modeling approaches to figure out the best and use them to create a decision support toolkit. So exciting to be part of this and fortunate to be able to work with folks out in Hawaii on over a 2-year period. The last piece I'll cover is looking at migratory species, and this is a really cool area that has implications certainly for Fish and Wildlife Service when they think about managing our wildlife, but also thinking about species that cross borders, and that's really how my postdoc advisor at the time, Darius Simmons, came up with this framework along with some colleagues for looking at how we value migratory species. And we had a working group at the USGS Powell Center, which is USGS's equivalent of an NCEAS or a CSync, and great research opportunity for folks to look at for bringing together folks for scientific synthesis work. But we worked on 3 species: the Mexican free-tailed bat, which migrates between central Mexico and the southwestern US, the northern pintail duck, which has a little bit of range in northern Mexico but migrates all the way up to the Arctic in the US and Canada, and monarch butterflies, which of course have their famous migration from the highlands in central Mexico all up through the eastern US and southern Canada. And so this framework, which we call a spatial subsidy framework, basically means that for each species we look at the annual value of all the ecosystem services. So we had a group of economists that I was part of that were working on the valuation of ecosystem services related to the species. and also the proportional habitat dependence. So summing up to 1, could we build models that show how much a migratory species depends on different parts of its habitat and match that to the value? And we use a framework where we calculate a subsidy, which is this Y, and this is positive or negative. An area is either supporting the continuing values of the species more broadly, or it's being supported by areas that provide more habitat. And essentially, for each region, we take the value of ecosystem services range-wide times the proportional dependence minus the value of ecosystem services for that region. And this will become a little clearer when I show an actual example here. So we're working on putting together the final data for northern pintail ducks. We've divided their region up into 5 primary areas, the western wintering region and on the Pacific coast, southern wintering on the Gulf Coast, the prairie pothole region, and 2 areas in the Arctic that they spend their summers in and for their breeding. And so we have ecosystem service values, primarily for hunting and fishing, but also for Native American subsistence values. We have their proportional habitat dependence on each of these ranges, and we calculate a subsidy. And one of the really interesting things we see here is the southern breeding region, which is basically the prairie potholes, the Dakotas, Montana, and the prairie provinces of Canada. We see that those areas are providing close to $12 million in value to the rest of the range. And that's just for a single species. Of course, there's a number of ducks and other waterfowl that are provided by these wetlands. But one of the things that most folks aren't aware of is that the U.S. actually makes a payment to Canada to help preserve wetlands in the Canadian provinces in the prairie region. And those are the types of programs that we know instinctively that they're providing waterfowl that benefits folks in the US and folks across the whole continent. But as we often think in the federal government, well, if those programs come under fire, people ask, why is that important? We can have the data here to show that these are providing ducks that are providing value to folks in America. And yeah, it's a good use of our tax dollars to compensate Canadian farmers to preserve wetlands on their property. So really interesting implications for cross-boundary management there, I think. A couple other findings. We're working up the final subsidy papers for those 3 species. For monarch butterflies, we did the first nationwide willingness to pay survey for monarchs, working with John Loomis and some other folks out of Colorado State. Came up with a number of $4.8 to $6.4 billion nationwide that folks would be willing to spend on monarchs. So this definitely raised some eyebrows, especially in a time when monarch numbers are essentially crashing. There's a petition out there right now to list the eastern migratory monarch as an endangered species, which is just crazy news for those of us who think back to 20 years ago when these things were super abundant. But hopefully that can provide some value and some incentive for conservation. We're looking at pintails, like I showed earlier, about $48 million a year in expenditures and consumer surplus on hunting and viewing. I did a little paper looking at the consumer surplus from bat viewing to caves and other places where bats nest in the southwestern U.S. And we looked at their pest control value and also using their ecosystem service values for pest control and wildlife viewing, along with habitat risk and dependence, to look at conservation prioritization for bat roosts in the southwestern U.S. And one of my favorite pieces that we've currently got in review is looking at the value of bats for agriculture. And this changes a lot depending on the use of transgenic crops, although some of those crops are developing resistance. It depends on how many bats there are and where the crop is, of course. And there was a paper that came out in Science a couple of years ago, which was just taking an extrapolation of one little study down in Texas and projecting this out over the whole U.S. And Brendan's familiar with this, it was saying how much do bats provide in pest control values, and it came up with a really big number, like some of the value transfer studies we see. But it's not taking into account a number of different factors locally, aside from bat population and cropland acreage. It's not taking into account specific crop values, use of GMO crops, the specific crop pests. A lot of pieces were missing from this analysis. So this was criticized by our own Dr. Vernon Fisher here, among others, and rightly so, I think, about incorrectly extrapolating value to the entire nation. Although it's useful as an awareness-raising exercise, it's not really getting at an accurate value that's going to help us out from a management perspective. But what we've done is taken these results and developed a study that develops a transfer function for pest control value in agricultural systems, and it looks at all sorts of predation, pesticide, pest, and agricultural factors. So we're really excited for this work, and I'm thinking especially as food prices and crop values fluctuate, as there's big changes in our agricultural landscapes, how can we use this information to still get a timely value for pest control in ag systems? I think from an agricultural perspective, it's really exciting stuff. So the next steps on this migratory species work, looking at actual conservation market designs and incentives programs for preserving these species. We can think about climate change impacts and how is climate change going to impact that dependence and migratory species populations. And we can think about how to extend that approach to other species. And this example is just willingness to pay of different groups for different areas of the monarch range. So that's a paper from this, or a figure from this monarch willingness to pay study that we did, but thinking about how can we actually convert that into conservation action. That's everything, and I'd be happy to take any questions if folks have follow-up. I'm happy
Two questions.
Yeah.
One, can the solve stuff feed into the GPI work you're doing by overlapping, like you do this 100-point assignment? What if they were asked to assign just points, not dollars, to actual ecosystem services, and then you could leverage that into a dollar measurement of the non-dollar valuated social services?
Folks have done that, where they ask people to map out ecosystem services, and I'm not a fan of it, honestly, mainly because the biophysical models and the actual perceptions don't line up very well for the general public. And I mean, things like biodiversity, nutrient cycling, water cycling, things that underlie ecosystem service provision, they're just not well understood by the public.
Like the general public's going to get that horribly wrong.
Yeah, right.
Undervalued, right?
Yeah.
But that would be part of the point then, that if we know solid dollar values for those things, or relatively solid dollar values, then if they're saying, oh, I'd only give 2% of my points to that, it's like, oh, then you must think the social values are worth millions.
Yeah, possibly. Need to think about that a little more.
Okay.
Yeah.
I really liked all your examples, and actually I think it was your first one that stood out in Colorado as two areas that were picked up by the biophysical model as being important, but not recognized as important to the public, or places that maybe biophysically weren't important, but were important to the public. Like it looked like a river valley was highlighted.
Yeah.
Maybe it's used for fishing, recreation type stuff.
Yeah, it's a huge fly fishing area.
So
yeah, exactly right.
How do you interpret those results, and what does that mean if you're working, say, with managers? Like, for example, it looked like there were areas that were biophysically important, and if they were in the wilderness region, people perceived them as important, but when they were, outside the wilderness region, but touching the wilderness region, so I assume they're part of the same sort of system, they weren't perceived by people as important. So what does that mean in terms of, I don't know, education or public perceptions and managers?
I think, I mean, it's not going to come as any shock for those of you working on ecosystem services that we still got a long way to go with the education side of things. And I think the services we looked at, which were water yield, sedimentation, which is essentially clean water, carbon sequestration and storage, and view sheds for both recreation and for property values, all really, really important stuff in that part of the world. And I think there's still a big educational hurdle to get over there in terms of showing people how and where ecosystems are valued and raising those public perceptions. But we've got a little bit more work to do on that, and I think as we get more forests and more national parks with those combined data sets, I think we're going to be able to say a lot more about it. So that's kind of dancing around your question, but I think it shows that there's a big gap between the places that are important and what people recognize and value, and that's part of why we do these mapping exercises. And Josh?
In one of your first slides, you were showing people allocating the $100 or the $1,000 among different cultural services. I thought you had it, but one was life support.
Yeah.
Is this like the pro-life debate, or? I mean,
No, this is, I mean, life support is literally like clean air, clean water, and soil, and that's basically how it's defined.
when you
And
put it as life support, it seems like most people kind of be pro-life.
you would think so. I've actually argued in this paper that we ought to drop a couple of things
There's a
from
previous
this
slide that showed
typology.
that there.
Yeah. I've actually argued in this paper, and that life-sustaining and biodiversity especially don't really go well with the rest of this list because they're poorly perceived by the public. Scientifically, we know they're critical, they underlie everything, but, and yeah, how could you be against, the basic growing things and living things that provide our economy, but they're kind of oddballs on this list, and I argued in this paper that we need to rethink this list a little bit.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question
Yeah.
on that? Sorry to butt
Yeah.
in, but the biodiversity one struck me as interesting because that to me sounds more like a biophysical one, but it's also on that list, the thing that you could also measure independently.
Yep.
So have you done that, and how does the perception of biodiversity hotspot pattern match up to some data-driven mapping thing from data? That's the one that you could measure two ways and ask how, data-driven versus survey-driven.
We did do that, and we had vertebrate species richness data for 460 species in the Southwest, and so it was a species richness layer, and we compared that to people's understanding. And people were valuing mountaintops for the most part, which are not very biodiverse in that alpine rock environment. So it was kind of hilariously wrong, actually, is the short answer.
Yep. Do you have more confidence that they're better at evaluating the other ones, or does that make you worry about the whole list?
No, I'm specifically worried about biodiversity and life sustaining. In this paper, we also did a statistical analysis of biodiversity against biodiversity value and life sustaining against those other ecosystem services, and those were all really weak to non-existent relationships too. The other services, I think, those are our cultural ecosystem services. Those are what we ought to be asking people about, and those are the things that a straight-up computer model, I wouldn't trust to tell me the areas that matter for spiritual or learning or historic, but asking people, I think that's the sweet spot of this type of method.
What is future?
It's kind of bequest value. Yeah, basically. So we have things like, option and bequest values, intrinsic values, nice non-use values too from an economic background. So this lets us spatially get at some of the non-use value too, which is cool when I put my economist hat on. Yeah, Bob?
This is sort of a question about existence values. In this mid-60s, there were threatened dams in the Grand Canyon. That's the reason I'm here and not doing physics somewhere. There's a new threat. You know about it. Some development actually on Navajo land, right down to the river. And I wondered, first of all, if you are working in it, and second, how this would work, especially the social part.
Yeah.
In that.
I've not worked on that part of the world. There are folks who have applied this framework with Native American groups, and I think it definitely resonates better than dollar values on some of these types of services. There's, I think some of the literature that I know suggests that there's a reluctance to place precise points, that culturally there's more of a fuzzy boundary thing going on in some indigenous culture, whereas, in the Western culture we might be okay saying, yeah, that's the place that I care about, but there's maybe more of an interconnectedness in the value systems from the folks I've seen apply this to Native American management questions, and it's been done, and they've found some interesting things, I think. But again, versus a willingness to pay survey or a biophysical GIS model, I think this type of method is probably a lot better for those types of applications. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you have a really good example of how this kind of research, which I think is really cool, has actually affected decision-making. So as opposed to saying, oh, the work we do is really important and here's why you should care about the work we're doing. I really am interested in that nexus of actually bringing information to people and them saying, oh, well, we're doing this wrong, or we should be doing this better.
Well, that's what I was telling Steve. He needs to come work on this from a federal perspective and continue some of his dissertation work on that. But I don't have a lot of, I don't have the good quantitative examples of that. I think a lot of the federal agencies are still seeing this as pilot projects, and they're kind of getting their feet wet with it, seeing where and how they might use the information. So, I wish I had a good example. The butterfly example might be one of the better ones, because there's a White House task force on pollinators and butterflies that's come out of the drastic declines we've seen in both of those groups. And we had a call across USGS for what's USGS doing on butterfly research, and people were instantly pretty excited about that. I mean, it's kind of the big number phenomenon, and we still have a lot of work to figure out how to translate into that into conservation action. But I think some of the migratory species stuff might be a good example of things that will translate pretty well for an agency like Fish and Wildlife and thinking about wildlife management.
Can I just do a quick follow-up? Can you imagine, if you get the information right, who specifically at those agencies really would use it? So I'm assuming you're talking to other researchers. Are there land management kind of decision-making, where's that nexus at the places you work with the most?
It's a couple different levels. I mean, for Department of Interior, we have an Office of Policy Analysis that's in Washington that thinks about these methods and what will work, what won't. They deal with a lot of legal and lawsuit type issues. There's the individual field offices, whether it's a park office at the NPS, whether it's a field office for the BLM, whether it's a ranger station or a Forest Service district. So I think a lot of the questions are going to be at that level, that regional level, out in the field. And the problem is they don't have the expertise, but they definitely have the management controversies and the management questions, and if we can deliver them the tools, then I think it's a good audience for that. For those of you who aren't familiar, one of these little report covers that I have up here is the 2012 National Forest Planning Rule, where they said we need to have ecosystem services included in our forest plans, and that's been really interesting for an agency to figure out how to go from 0 to 60 on doing ecosystem service assessments, which is just an added piece on top of NEPA, on top of their existing planning rules. So part of our job, I think, as federal scientists is, okay, how can we make that scientifically rigorous but not such a burden that folks will try not to do it. Yeah.
I'm curious, getting back into the study that Jillian was talking about, I'm wondering if you see any danger in these high-low social and biophysical categories. And then I noticed on that map, so the blue area was the part that you were saying, okay, go develop because it's not particularly ecologically or socially, culturally important. So one, I'm curious, have historical or even contemporary development patterns been in those blue areas? And if you've overlaid that sort of data onto this. And second, in just these, researcher defined categories of high and low and how many gradations you have in between, and is there any danger in releasing this to the public and saying this land is worthless for any public values?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, yeah, that's I think if you gave this to the public, they wouldn't want to write off the entire picture, which is most of the map, as sacrifice zones. One of the other big things that I didn't even touch on is, of course, the method you use for identifying hotspots, and there's different statistical methods folks have used for hotspot delineation. So we're going to be doing a sensitivity analysis of that in the 6th Forest piece, and showing how they differ and talking about some of the implications there. But like I said, this is a really new heuristic that we came up with, and so there's a lot of pieces still to think through and to do on the ground. And the looking at the change in the threat, like you suggest, is I think really relevant. One of the things we face in the West, of course, is forest fire risk and forest thinning, and particularly for water management around reservoirs, because if we get those fires on some of the areas that contribute immediately to the reservoirs, you get this huge input of sediment, and dredging these reservoirs is really costly. So City of Denver actually has a payments for ecosystem services program where every water owner or water user is paying the Forest Service to manage the lands around the reservoirs for forest thinning and fire reduction. So that's an example of the type of management question they're dealing with there. And some of those areas may well not show up on this map, and we need to do some more looking at that. Yeah.
Hey Ken, thanks, that was a great talk.
Thanks.
Just a question, sorry for being a little dense. Can you explain a little bit more about the migration, the pintail duck one, and the negative subsidy areas and how that works out?
Yeah, for sure. So at least in theory, the positive subsidy means that we have a relatively high, or the positive value here means we have a relatively high habitat dependence relative to the size of the ecosystem service value in the region. These aren't super populated areas. People do go duck hunting and wildlife viewing there, but not in the numbers that they do in California, certainly. California, has this negative subsidy value. That's because it has lower habitat dependence, still fairly high, but lower dependence and much higher ecosystem service value. And this is really, we've shied away from saying that this means that California and Oregon ought to be sending $12 million to the southern breeding zone. I mean, that's one way to interpret this, but it's certainly a way of understanding where there's extra value being realized and where there's high habitat dependence. And in theory, we want to, if we're not going to directly say California, write a check for $12 million, which we know in their budget situation they'd probably be a little reluctant to do, but identifying the places where there might be willingness to pay, thinking about mechanisms to capture that value and to send to the places that have high habitat dependence. And then threats, the other thing we need to look at there too, for sure. And with between a lot of the oil and gas on the Bakken Formation in North Dakota, climate change impacts the prairie potholes, ag intensification, there's probably plenty of threat here, unfortunately. Yeah.
I'm thinking more like on a federal level. Is there anything that you could do or alter this so that the redder areas, when back of the value it could bring to keep that area from being harvested or turned into housing, or is there any translation that could turn into prevention from future use, or is it just a recommendation?
Well, it's definitely just a recommendation, but those are the areas that, when we talk to a management agency, especially when there's high social value and high ecosystem service value, unfortunately the language that they understand is the public getting upset, the threat of lawsuits, things like that. And so there's a huge interest among land management agencies in reducing exposure to that, and there ought to be for all of us. These are public lands, and we ought to be managing them for the public good. And so even if the red areas here are not formally protected, they're not wilderness, for example, or they're not formally protected, those are the areas you can make a good case that, we ought to think about protecting. And so that gets us back to Monica's question about, it's really important that we think about how these hotspots are analyzed, how they're drawn. There's a lot more to think about here. But from a conservation perspective, we identify the important areas, but then it's, I think, especially in this upper right corner or upper left corner, this is the area where we can make a good case that the public will support conservation, and they're really important areas for ecosystem services, again, assuming there's synergy between those uses.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the ecosystem services of a duck. Because I kind of, maybe it's semantics, but I think of ecosystem services as coming from, a forest or an ocean or a more complex system, the habitat that a duck would live in and what the duck does might be part of that. So I could kind of imagine the pollination and the insect control of your other species. But I'm trying to figure out, is it more traditional? What's the value of a duck to hunters? And then what did the hunters spend in local communities? Or how did you do that? And it seems like other people have been measuring that, but not necessarily calling it ecosystem services, I think. So I didn't know if there's any difference in what you were.
Yeah, recreational value, I think most folks have called it, but Fish and Wildlife does regular surveys of hunting. I mean, that's one of their major, both for National Wildlife Refuge Management and for thinking about the whole species persistence. Hunting numbers are really important, and for thinking about, how many duck stamps they issue, how many permits, et cetera. But yeah, I'd argue that for the migratory species, it's not tied to a specific parcel of land over the course of its lifespan. So it can provide ecosystem service values anywhere throughout its range. Is the framework we've been thinking about. And so we have looked at the duck hunting one is, I believe we looked at consumer surplus for consistency with the wildlife viewing. For wildlife viewing, there's this really cool, or for bird watching rather, there's this really cool database called eBird that's run out of Cornell that people actually self-report where they see species. And so we've been thinking about how can we use that citizen science data to parcel out bird watching values by species and spatially, which is, we're really excited about that method. And then for indigenous communities, we were looking at replacement costs, which we know is just one tiny component of the value of hunting to Native Americans and Inuit people, but we're saying it's better than giving a value of 0 and recognizing that there's high cultural value there too. Yeah.
So I have a question about these high areas. So first, like a clarification, so all the colored areas are within a nationally protected?
Yeah, this is a national forest right here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I wonder if the high red areas, the public perception value is influenced by the way we manage that resource to begin with. So if there are hiking trails up to the top of a peak, it seems to me that that would be more likely red than another peak that doesn't have trails up to it, say. So I wonder how, if you thought about that, how you controlled for it, or how you could. I mean, I'm also interested in how this could be extrapolated beyond existing lands that are sort of locked up already. How do you prioritize land acquisition, like expanding areas? Is this a model that you could use for that?
Well, our 10-year dream is to have enough of these studies that we could produce regional or national map of these things. That's, there's a lot of, that's super ambitious and maybe not realistic, but yeah, for thinking about non-protected areas, it's important. For the access question, this is going to be way too fuzzy to see, but this is the results that Maxent generates for looking at the relationship between an underlying biophysical variable and the value that people place. And so one of the things we've used is distance to roads, which is definitely an access-related variable. We definitely could add distance to trails in. I mean, this is a really interesting area to work in right now because it's just like regression or any other kind of statistical modeling where you're picking what variables you think are going to be influential in your model. Only the literature's too new for us to really be guided by theory. So there's a little bit of experimentation happening, which is a cool place to be at, but there's more theoretical work that could go into it. Just the fact that people marked these wilderness areas as important, when by definition, even if they've got trails, they're going to be harder to get to. That in its own, we thought was a really interesting finding from this. And I think when we look at the wilderness question in Colorado versus northwest Wyoming, where we have some different values and demographics, that's going to be an interesting story too. But yeah, more work to do on that, I think.
So we're getting pretty close to 1 o'clock, so maybe one last question.
Sure. Yeah.
Actually, it's sort of two questions, but one's more technical. And you were looking at the San Pedro watershed
Mhm.
and some of the differences between Invest and Aries.
Mhm.
Could you tease out whether those differences were being driven by the underlying biophysical models or the valuation?
Definitely wasn't the valuation. We used the same, the same unit cost for water, same social cost of carbon. So yeah, we were trying to do, we were definitely trying to make the comparison as apples to apples as possible. So we were using the same underlying data sets and the same valuation data. It was just the model structure and assumptions that differed there. Yeah.
And more philosophical,
Mhm.
sort of thinking about all this blue area, have you encountered sort of resistance among scientists and the agencies to using ecosystem services?
No, I mean, if anything, folks are interested in it, I think, and some of that's coming, there's a lot of good reasons to use ecosystem services. I think some of these benefits shown up here. The question is, can we do it on top of our existing burden for NEPA, for management, for planning? And so we're trying to think about, for these different agency planning processes, how can this fit in, and how can we try to do it in a way that doesn't kill folks with the burden to do it. And one thing that's really interesting that I'm excited to, literally just got started on the Cape Lookout project with the Park Service, was basically a new project. It was sort of how I want to do an ecosystem service project from start to finish in terms of like public engagement and building new models and everything else. The Rocky Mountain project is basically using Solves and Aries data for the surrounding national forests. Rocky Mountain's sandwiched between two national forests in Colorado, and we'd already done the work for the Forest Service, so we came to the Park Service and we said, hey, we got this data we could use, but it hasn't specifically been collected for this purpose. And there's been an ongoing discussion about like how useful is that, but there's also an order of magnitude difference in the cost to do those two different things. And as we have different agencies, we'll have a wildlife refuge that does an ecosystem service study and there's surrounding national forest land. We'll have BLM does a study and there's a next door national park. We're gonna have more cases of these agencies doing individual studies. And when we think about it at the landscape scale, there's an opportunity there to use that information more broadly. And that's really the dialogue that we're excited to start with, that is thinking, okay, so your agency didn't do this study, someone else did, but how can we leverage it for your decision making? And those are the types of ways that we might be able to drive down costs and still provide some management information.
Well, thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everyone.